Cadets at the Virginia Military Institute, a historic and highly regarded private military college that feeds a lot of officers to our military institutions. VMI in Lexington, Virginia, Governor Romney selecting it as the site of his foreign policy speech. Let's listen.
Tireless campaign companion, Governor Bob McDonnell. We have traveled the state together time and time again, and he goes all over the country helping me. He is also showing here in Virginia what conservative leadership can do to build a stronger economy. And thank you also to Congressman Goodlatte for joining us today. I appreciate his service and leadership. And particular thanks to General P. I appreciate his invitation to be with you today at the Virginia Military Institute. It's a privilege to be at an institution like this. It has done so much for our nation, both in times of war and in times of peace. For more than 170 years, VMI has done more than educate students. It has guided their transformation into citizens, warriors, and leaders. VMI graduates have served with honor in our nation's defense, just as many are doing today in Afghanistan and in other lands. And since September 11th attacks, many of VMI's sons and daughters have defended America, and I mourn with you the 15 brave souls who have been lost. I join you in praying for the many VMI graduates who are right now serving in harm's way. May God bless all who serve and all who have served. Of all the VMI graduates, none is more distinguished perhaps than General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, who became Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who helped vanquish fascism and then planned Europe's rescue from despair. His commitment to peace was born of his direct knowledge of the awful costs and consequences of war. General Marshall once said, quote, "The only way human beings can win a war is to prevent it." Those words were true in his time, and they are true in our time. Last month, our nation was attacked again. A U.S. ambassador and 3 of our fellow Americans are dead, murdered in Benghazi, Libya. Among the dead were 3 veterans. All of them were fine men on a mission of peace and friendship to a nation that clearly longs for both. President Obama has said that Ambassador Chris Stevens and his colleagues represented the best of America, and he's right. We all mourn their loss. The attacks against us in Libya were not an isolated incident. They were accompanied by anti-American riots in nearly 24 other countries, most in the Middle East, but also in Africa and Asia. Our embassies have been attacked. Our flag has been burned. Many of our citizens have been threatened and driven from their overseas homes by vicious mobs shouting "Death to America." These mobs hoisted the black banner of Islamic extremism over American embassies on the anniversary of 9/11. As the dust settles, as the murdered are buried, Americans are asking how this happened, how the threats we face have grown worse, and what this calls on America to do. These are the right questions, and I've come here today to offer a larger perspective on these tragic recent events and to share with you and to share with all Americans my vision for a freer, more prosperous, and more peaceful world. The attacks on America last month should not be seen as random acts. They're expressions of a larger struggle that is playing out across the broader Middle East, a region that's now in the midst of the most profound upheaval in a century. And the fault lines of this struggle can be seen clearly in Benghazi itself. The attack on our consulate there on September 11, 2012, was likely the work of forces affiliated with those that attacked our homeland on September 11, 2001. This latest assault can't be blamed on a reprehensible video insulting Islam, despite the administration's attempts to convince us of that for so long. No, as the administration has finally conceded, these attacks were the deliberate work of terrorists who use violence to impose their dark ideology on others, especially on women and girls, who are fighting to control much of the Middle East today and who seek to wage perpetual war on the West. We saw all of this in Benghazi last month, but we also saw something else, something hopeful. After the attack on our consulate, tens of thousands of Libyans, most of them young people, held a massive protest in Benghazi against the very extremists who had murdered our people. They waved signs that read, "The ambassador was Libya's friend," and "Libya is sorry." They chanted, "No to militias, no to militias." They marched, unarmed, to the terrorist compound, and then they burned it to the ground. As one Libyan woman said, "We are not going to go from darkness to darkness." This is the struggle that's now shaking the entire Middle East. It's the struggle of millions and millions of people, men and women, young and old, Muslims, Christians, and non-believers, all of whom have had enough of the darkness. It's a struggle for the dignity that comes with freedom and opportunity and the right to live under laws of our own making. It's a struggle that's been unfolded under green banners in the streets of Iran, in the public squares of Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen, and in the fights for liberty in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and now in Syria. In short, it's a struggle between liberty and tyranny, justice and oppression, hope and despair. We've seen this struggle before. It'd be familiar to General George Marshall. In his time, the ashes of World War, another critical part of the world, was torn between democracy and despotism. Fortunately, we had leaders of courage and vision, both Republicans and Democrats, who knew that America had to support friends who shared our values and prevent today's crises from becoming tomorrow's conflicts. Statesmen like Marshall rallied our nation to rise to its responsibilities as the leader of the free world. We helped our friends to build and sustain free societies and free markets. We defended our friends and ourselves from our common enemies. We led. We led. And though the path was long and uncertain, the thought of war in Europe is as inconceivable today as it seemed inevitable in the last century. This is what makes America exceptional. It is not only the character of our country, it is also the record of our accomplishments. America has a proud history of strong, confident, principled global leadership, a history that's been written by patriots of both parties. This is America at its best, and it is the standard by which we measure every president, as well as anyone who wishes to be president. Unfortunately, this president's policies have not been equal to our best examples of world leadership, and nowhere is this more evident than in the Middle East. I want to be very clear. The blame for the murder of our people in Libya and the attacks on our embassies in so many other countries lies solely with those who carried them out, no one else. But it is our responsibility and the responsibility of the president to use America's greatest power to shape history, not to lead from behind, leaving our destiny at the mercy of events. Unfortunately, that's exactly where we find ourselves in the Middle East under President Obama. The relationship between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel, for example, our closest ally in the region, has suffered great strains. The President explicitly stated that his goal was to put daylight between the United States and Israel, and he succeeded. This is a dangerous situation that has set back the hope of peace in the Middle East and emboldened our mutual adversaries, especially Iran. Iran today has never been closer to a nuclear weapons capability. It has never posed a greater danger to our friends, our allies, and us, and has never acted less deterred by America, as was made clear last year when Iranian agents plotted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in our nation's capital. And yet, when millions of Iranians took to the streets in June 2009, when they demanded freedom from a cruel regime that threatens the world, when they cried out, "Are you with us or are you with them?" the American president was silent. Across the greater Middle East, as the joy born from the downfall of dictators has given way to the painstaking work of building capable security forces and growing economies and developing effective democratic institutions, the president has failed to offer the tangible support that our partners want and need. In Iraq, the costly gains made by our troops are being eroded by rising violence, a resurgent al-Qaeda, the weakening of democracy in Baghdad, and the rising influence of Iran. And yet America's ability to influence events for the better in Iraq has been undermined by the abrupt withdrawal of our entire troop presence. The President's tried. He tried, but he also failed to secure a responsible and gradual drawdown that would have better secured our gains. The President has also failed to lead in Syria, where more than 30,000 men, women, and children have been massacred by the Assad regime over the past 20 months. Violent extremists are flowing into the fight. Our ally Turkey has been attacked, and the conflict threatens stability in the region. America can take pride in the blows that our military and intelligence professionals have inflicted on al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, including the killing of Osama bin Laden. These are real achievements won at a high cost. Al-Qaeda remains a strong force, however, in Yemen and Somalia, in Libya and other parts of North Africa, in Iraq, and now in Syria. And other extremists have gained ground across the region. Drones and modern instruments of war are important tools in our fight, but they are no substitute for a national security strategy for the Middle East. The President is fond of saying that the tide of war is receding, and I want to believe him as much as anyone else. But when we look at the Middle East today, with Iran closer than ever to nuclear weapons capability, with the conflict in Syria threatening to destabilize the region, and with violent extremists on the march, and with an American ambassador and 3 others dead, likely at the hands of al-Qaeda affiliates, it's clear that the risk of conflict in the region is higher now than when the President took office. I know the President hopes for a safer, freer, and more prosperous Middle East allied with us. I share this hope. But hope is not a strategy. We can't support our friends and defeat our enemies in the Middle East when our words are not backed up by deeds, when our defense spending is being arbitrarily and deeply cut, when we have no trade agenda to speak of, and the perception of our strategy is not one of partnership, but of passivity. The greater tragedy of it all is that we're missing an historic opportunity to win new friends who share our values in the Middle East. Friends who are fighting for their own futures against the very same violent extremists and evil tyrants and angry mobs who seek to harm us. Unfortunately, so many of these people who could be our friends feel that our President is indifferent to their quest for freedom and dignity. As one Syrian woman put it, "We will not forget that you forgot about us." It's time to change course in the Middle East. That course should be organized around these bedrock principles. America must have confidence in our cause, clarity in our purpose, and resolve in our might. No friend of America will question our commitment to support them. No enemy that attacks America will question our resolve to defeat them. And no one anywhere, friend or foe, will doubt America's capability to back up our words. I'll put the leaders of Iran on notice that the United States and our friends and allies will prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. I will not hesitate to impose new sanctions on Iran, and will tighten the sanctions we currently have. I'll restore the permanent presence of aircraft carrier task forces in both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf. And I'll work with Israel to increase our military assistance and coordination. For the sake of peace, we must make clear to Iran through actions, not just words, that their nuclear pursuit will not be tolerated. I'll reaffirm our historic ties to Israel and our abiding commitment to its security. The world must never see any daylight between our two nations. I'll deepen our critical cooperation with our partners in the Gulf, and I'll roll back President Obama's deep and arbitrary cuts to our national defense that would devastate our military. I'll make the critical defense investments that we need to remain secure. The decisions we make today will determine our ability to protect America tomorrow. The first purpose of a strong military is to prevent war. The size of our Navy is at levels not seen since 1916. I'll restore our Navy to the size needed to fulfill our missions by building 15 ships per year, including 3 submarines. I'll implement effective missile defenses to protect against threats. And on this, there will be no flexibility with Vladimir Putin. And I will call on our NATO allies to keep the greatest military alliance in history strong by honoring their commitment to each devote 2% of their GDP to security spending. Today, only 3 of the 28 NATO nations meet this benchmark. I'll make further reforms to our foreign assistance to create incentives for good governance, for free enterprise, and for greater trade in the Middle East and beyond. I'll organize all assistance efforts in the greater Middle East under one official with responsibility and accountability to prioritize efforts and to produce results. I'll rally our friends and our allies to match our generosity with theirs. And I'll make it clear to the recipients of our aid that in return for our material support, they must meet the responsibilities of every decent modern government to respect the rights of all their citizens, including women and minorities, to ensure space for civil society, a free media, political parties, and an independent judiciary, and to abide by their international commitments to protect our diplomats and our property. I'll champion free trade and restore it as a critical element of our strategy, both in the Middle East and across the world. The President has not signed one new free trade agreement in the past 4 years. I'll reverse that failure. I'll work with nations around the world that are committed to the principles of free enterprise, expanding existing relationships, and establishing new ones. I'll support friends across the Middle East who share our values, but need help defending them and their sovereignty against our common enemies. In Libya, I'll support the Libyan people's efforts to forge a lasting government that represents all of them. And I'll vigorously pursue the terrorists who attacked our consulate in Benghazi and killed our fellow Americans. In Egypt, I'll use our influence, including clear conditions on our aid, to urge the new government to represent all Egyptians, to build democratic institutions, and to maintain its peace treaty with Israel. And we must persuade our friends and allies to place similar stipulations on their aid. In Syria, I'll work with our partners to identify and organize those members of the opposition who share our values, and then ensure that they obtain the arms they need to defeat Assad's tanks and helicopters and fighter jets. Iran is sending arms to Assad because they know his downfall would be a strategic defeat for them. We should be working no less vigorously through our international partners to support the many Syrians who would deliver that defeat to Iran rather than sitting on the sidelines. It's essential that we develop influence with those forces in Syria that will one day lead a country that sits at the heart of the Middle East. In Afghanistan, I'll pursue a real and successful transition to Afghan security forces by the end of 2014. President Obama would have you believe that anyone who disagrees with his decisions in Afghanistan is arguing for endless war. But the route to war and to potential attacks here at home is a politically timed retreat that abandons the Afghan people to the same extremists who ravaged their country and used it to launch the attacks of 9/11. I'll evaluate conditions on the ground and weigh the best advice of our military commanders, and I will affirm that my duty is not to protect my political prospects, but to protect the security of the nation. Finally, I'll recommit America to the goal of a democratic, prosperous Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with the Jewish state of Israel. On this vital issue, the President has failed, and what should be a negotiation process has devolved into a series of heated disputes at the UN. In this old conflict, as in every challenge we face in the Middle East, only a new president will bring the chance to begin anew. There's a longing for American leadership in the Middle East, and it's not unique to that region. It's broadly felt by America's friends and allies in other parts of the world as well. In Europe, where Putin's Russia casts a long shadow over young democracies, and where our oldest allies have been told we're pivoting away from them. In Asia and across the Pacific, where China's recent assertiveness is sending chills throughout that region. And here in our own hemisphere, where our neighbors in Latin America want to resist the failed ideology of Hugo Chavez and the Castro brothers and deepen ties with the United States on trade and energy and security. But in all these places, just as in the Middle East, the question is asked, where does America stand? I know many Americans are asking a different question. Why us? I know many Americans are asking whether our country today, with our ailing economy and our massive debt, and after 11 years of war, is still capable of leading. I believe that if America doesn't lead, others will. Others who don't share our interests and our values. And the world would grow darker for our friends and for us. America's security and the cause of freedom cannot afford 4 more years like the last 4 years. I'm running for president because I believe the leader of the free world has a duty to our citizens and to our friends everywhere to use America's great influence wisely, with solemnity, and without false pride, but also firmly and actively to shape events in ways that secure our interests, further our values, prevent conflict, and make the world better. Not perfect, but better. Our friends and allies across the globe don't want less American leadership. They want more. More of our moral support, more of our security cooperation, more of our trade, more of our assistance in building free societies and thriving economies. So many people across the world still look to America as the best hope of humankind. So many people still have faith in America. We must show them that we still have faith in ourselves, that we have the will and the wisdom to revive our stagnant economy, to roll back our unsustainable debt, to reform our government, to reverse the catastrophic cuts now threatening our national defense, to renew the sources of our great power, and to lead the course of human events. Sir Winston Churchill once said of George Marshall, he always fought victoriously against defeatism, discouragement, and disillusion. That's the role our friends want America to play again, and it's the role we must play. The 21st century can and must be an American century. It began with terror and war and economic calamity. It's our duty to steer it onto the path of freedom and peace and prosperity. The torch America carries is one of decency and hope. It's not America's torch alone, but it is America's duty and honor to hold it high enough that all the world can see its light. Thank you so much for your participation in this great charge. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Remarks from Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, Governor Romney, at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia, West Central Virginia, one of the nation's premier private military academies. There you see the cadets in their, well, dress whites. That's really their daily garb there. I was actually just there last week visiting Lexington, a town of about 7,500 in West Central Virginia, but it is home to a couple of the pillars of the South. General Robert E. Lee is buried there on the campus of Washington and Lee University. Also, Stonewall Jackson buried there. And George Marshall is a graduate of VMI. You heard the governor mention George Marshall, who went on to become Secretary of State, also a prominent Army general as well, the author of the Marshall Plan. And that is what the president, in both the beginning, the governor, that is what, in the beginning and at the end of his speech, he pointed to the contribution that George Marshall made to world affairs. That's part of the reason for the setting of this speech. Let's talk about it now with Michael O'Hanlon, the co-author of Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. He is also a senior fellow on foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. Also with us, General Bob Scales, a retired U.S. Army general and a Fox News military analyst. General Scales, to you first. He suggested that a more muscular foreign policy, especially with regards to the Middle East, is needed right now. Did you hear it that way?
Boy, I sure did, John. One of the things I find so interesting is this is the first speech I've seen the governor give where he establishes a clear separation with the current administration. First of all, he focuses almost exclusively on the Middle East and not on China or Russia. Secondly, his tone is more strident, more confrontational, and a clear swing away from sort of the soft power approach of this administration over to a more strident and a harder power approach to our national security. He also talked about not reducing the defense budget substantially and increasing our level of security in our armed forces, which we haven't heard before. So this speech, I think, sort of stakes out his national security for the first time, and there is a clear separation between what he said just a few minutes ago and what we've heard from the current administration.
You know, Michael, General Scales is picking up on something that we've really heard a lot about over the last couple months, and the criticism of the Romney campaign is that they haven't drawn a clear enough distinction between their foreign policy and the foreign policy of this current administration. How did you hear it? What would you point out as some of the major differences between what a Romney administration would look like and what another 4 years of President Obama might look like?
Yeah, I thought it was a good speech, too, even for a person who doesn't think badly of President Obama's foreign policy. I thought it was actually useful, partly because it reinforced the need for American engagement in the world. And I think General Scales is correct. There was a military aspect to that, which I personally may not consider necessary, but I still welcome the general tone of more engagement, even if I don't think defense spending has to go up or stay where Governor Romney proposes, because there's a lot of Americans, as we know, who are tired of these wars, tired of the unrest, discouraged by the anti-Americanism they see throughout the broader Islamic world in particular, and maybe in a mood of let's come home, America, let's mend our own problems and heal our own wounds for a while. And that's understandable, and it's partly, I think, right. But if we take it too far, we can get ourselves into trouble. And now we hear Governor Romney arguing not just for more military spending, but for more foreign aid, or at least more effective foreign aid, better coordinated. We hear him arguing even for a word, dare I say, that sounds like nation building in places like Libya, where he wants to do more to help these countries get on their feet after the revolutions that they've been through. He didn't use the word nation building, of course, but he was talking about staying engaged and helping them build up institutions and being very patient and getting out of Afghanistan. So I like the tone of patience and engagement, even if I may disagree on certain specific substantive matters. One
of the things that Mitt Romney pointed to, General Scales, is this comment that the president first mentioned in June of 2011, the tide of war is receding. And Mitt Romney said he'd like to believe the president, but he obviously doesn't think that's the case. What's your opinion now, where we stand in 2012? Is the tide of war receding or not?
Well, it's hard to say, Jenna, but one thing that Governor Romney did say is that under his administration, he will focus principally on the greater Middle East. He'll focus on these trouble spots, which seem to getting worse and worse by the day. And he sent a message, I think, to leaders in the Middle East that he's sort of going to re-engage in a more confrontational and aggressive fashion. Is the world safer today than it was just a few years ago? No, I don't think so, because I think that the peace that we've tried to establish in the Middle East, frankly, is beginning to fray, in large measure because many leaders in the Middle East are beginning to question American resolve in that region. And what the governor's trying to do is bring focus back on this region, to focus on the wars we have rather than the wars we want, Jenna.
Michael, the phrase lead from behind is something that Governor Romney used, and he said, I'm going to throw that out. Now, the Obama administration, and you've said that you have not been entirely unhappy with Obama administration foreign policy, but they sort of wore that phrase as a badge of honor, especially during the NATO bombardment of Libya. Is there going to be a remarkable change on that score should Mitt Romney become president?
It's a good question. You know, that's part of why I liked Governor Romney's tone, because I think it'll push the debate on both sides into a place that's more engaged. You're right that the Obama administration, well, it may not have come up with that term, leading from behind. It did seem to characterize to some extent its approach in Libya, which I thought was actually effective through 2011. But here we are in 2012, and we're in a mode of trying to bring the forces home. We're nervous about talking about foreign assistance at a time of big federal budget deficits. And what Governor Romney's done, I think, is make it easier to debate on both sides in terms of what are the next steps we need to take as Americans to stay engaged and contribute so that this region doesn't become more turbulent and more dangerous. So it becomes a little bit more politically acceptable to talk about perhaps offering the Libyans more assistance for their security forces. If President Morsi in Egypt is willing to stay engaged in a positive fashion with us and with Israel, to maybe offer him a little more assistance. That's a tone and a style of debate that I would welcome, because I feel that politicians otherwise tend to fear we've got to talk about retrenchment and withdrawal given the problems we're having back here in the United States. That's not necessarily good for our foreign policy. I think Romney's pushed it in a better direction.
With the murder of our first ambassador in 30 years, more than 30 years, and those other 3 Americans, turbulent and dangerous is appropriate language. Jenna.
A quick final question for both of you. The reason why I asked the question about whether or not the tide of war is receding is because from that standpoint, a lot of philosophy is made, right? And a lot of foreign policy can come from whether you believe the tide of war is receding or whether or not it's not indeed. So we had this big vice presidential debate on Thursday, and I'm curious just quickly, General Scales, first to you and Michael, then to you. What do you want to hear more about in that debate? What do you think is crucial for the American people to hear more about? General Scales?
Thanks. I want the American people to hear how committed both sides are to forward engagement, particularly in the Middle East. I want the American people to get a sense, the tone, if you will, of both candidates, to get a sense between the two who has the more forward-looking, aggressive, confrontational a style of policy versus the other. It'll be very, very interesting, Jenna.
Michael?
I like that, but I would say I want to hear on Russia and China, despite the fact this speech was largely on the Middle East. I want to hear a little more about how a President Romney or President Obama would address the current problems we face with them right now. Governor Romney said he didn't want to bend on any missile defense options. I understand his logic. I also understand President Obama's logic to have come up with a better plan, I think, than he inherited. So Russia and China are complicated, big countries. We need nuanced policies. We have to avoid either we're just friends or we're just adversaries. And I think hearing more nuance to those two countries and the discussion about them would be helpful on Thursday night.
Very interesting observation there about we didn't hear too much about them in this speech, and we'll see if we hear more on Thursday. Michael and General Scales, pleasure to have you both today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you.